So what this bill is an opportunity for our neighbors to be able to create housing.
Suburbia will be no longer as we know it.
Die Verbindungen zwischen deiner Heimat oder ihrer Heimat, die sind ja unübersehbar.
A petition to stop the rezoning has more than 400 signatures right now.
In today's video, I'll be showing you why this kind of neighborhood, the very neighborhoods that I love about living in Germany, would be completely illegal to build in the United States. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here, so let's go ahead and get started. So why even compare the United States and Germany? Well, I mean, the obvious answer is because I'm an American who happens to live in Germany. But there's actually a lot of practical reasons why they make a great comparison when it comes to zoning and housing specifically. Much of the zoning policies that we have today developed from 19th century nuisance laws, which aim to address the dangerous conditions of the polluted industrial city. By the 1860s, other EU countries like Italy and France had already adopted regulations to protect housing from factories. And while a handful of American cities had made similar attempts, it wasn't really widespread. But in the 1870s and 80s, it was German reformers who invented the idea of zoning an entire city into separate residential and industrial districts. In 1891, Frankfurt became one of the first large cities in the world to have a citywide zoning plan with use-based districts. And it was this German system that actually inspired US zoning practices. And today, the planning systems in both Germany and the United States share a lot of fundamental features. Like I mentioned in last week's video, both countries are federations with national, state, and local levels of government. In both, the federal level plays a limited role in planning by providing the key framework documents, while most land use planning occurs locally. But most importantly, in both the US and German systems, they share an overarching premise. In both, development is guaranteed by right, as long as property owners abide by the legal rules. And this is far from trivial because not all planning systems around the world operate in this way. But from the start, there were some notable differences that would ultimately lead German neighborhoods to be a lot more walkable, livable, and lively, and American neighborhoods to be nearly completely dependent on the car. Even from the 19th century, when urban zoning was still in its infancy, German regulations focused on bulk and density, while the US regulations emphasized land use control. So let's get started by first briefly introducing the German approach. German planners from the very beginning rarely prohibited all industry from residential areas. Rather, they permitted it under performance standards. So in German codes, commercial uses were permitted in all parts of a town. They were only banned amid residences only if they released noxious fumes. Single and multifamily dwellings were almost always allowed to coexist freely because in legal texts in the beginning, they rarely distinguished between the two different types of housing. Today, municipal land use regulation in Germany is guided by the federal statute, the Federal Land Use Ordinance, also called the Baunutzungsverordnung. The BauNVO lists 4 land use classes: residential, mixed, commercial, and special. And these are then divided into 10 subclasses that you see up on your screen. But for my American viewers, don't let the titles of these confuse you because pretty much all of them would still be considered mixed use by the American standard. Let me explain. Small-scale residential areas may still allow the following uses by right: single and two-family homes, farms, small shops, restaurants, crafts, and non-disturbing industries, which generally means that they can't be loud. And even the exclusively residential areas, despite their name, still permit by right all dwellings without distinguishing between single and multifamily, but also permit small shops, crafts, hotels, and civic buildings as special uses. And the reason why they allow for all of these different types of uses inside a residential zone really does boil down to how the Germans define residing or living in the first place. As one urban and planning official states, clearly the residential classes are intended so that people can have normal and comfortable living conditions. They are, as their names say, meant for living. But how do you define living? You obviously need shelter, but you cannot really sustain living without an easy access to things that make that life possible, like buying bread or other basic necessities. So having access to such services seems to me a part of living as having shelter. They really are part of the same. So if someone proposes a store in a living district, my thought is whether it enhances living. If it's a big specialized store, most people don't need it on their lives on a daily basis. But if it's a small bakery, I see that as part of daily living. Now, to be fair, there are still many blocks in German cities that end up being single use. And even here in Freiburg, it still sometimes feels a lot like the United States on the outskirts of town, where you'll have monofunctional chunks of land occupied by mega stores or industrial campuses. So if you're from here in Freiburg, I'm talking about the area around the Messe, the new Europaparkstadion, or IKEA. IKEA. I'm American. I'm sorry. But despite these industrial big box areas, it's important to note that the small-scale residential class, which limits dwellings to only single and two-family homes, is really mostly just used in small villages. The exclusively residential class, which does not restrict dwelling types, but allows non-residential only as conditional uses, today takes only an estimated 5 to 10% of Stuttgart and does not exist in the city of Bonn at all. But by contrast, 66% of Metro Detroit and 80% of Metro Cleveland are under single-family zoning, which bans all but single-family houses and their accessories. And speaking of the US, that's actually a pretty good transition for us to have a short discussion on US zoning systems. From early on, US planners were much more keen on separation. And throughout the 20th century, American planners have been credited with inventing at least 4 different zoning ideas. And by the consecutive application of these, US zoning evolved over time in a clear direction towards more use separation, ultimately resulting in what is called Euclidean zoning. Named from the US Supreme Court decision Euclid versus Ambler, Euclidean zoning is the separation of land uses by type, namely residential, commercial, retail, and industrial, each into their own zones or areas within a given city. And while Euclidean zoning is frequently associated with the development patterns of suburbia, it's the most common form of zoning code, or the local legal tool for controlling the uses of development of land in the United States. Even the largest cities in the US have relied on Euclidean zoning throughout most of the 20th century and up until the present day. Now, Euclidean zoning in and of itself isn't bad in theory. Without zoning regulations, there's the risk of incompatible land use, such as building a factory next door to a residential home, which can cause a variety of issues, including decreasing property values. Except America kind of went overboard with how strictly it applied this separation of land uses, often permitting only one type of use in each zone and excluding any potential variation of it. So most residential zones in cities not only exclude industrial and retail uses from residential neighborhoods, most residential zones also exclude variation among residences. For example, houses are typically acceptable, but often you'll find that apartment buildings are not. As you can imagine, Euclidean zoning strategies spread with the rise of the sprawling suburban communities, and it dramatically changed the urban landscape. It not only forced local businesses out of residential neighborhoods, but people became more and more dependent on automobiles for commutes and daily needs. Now, I don't want to be too abstract here, so I think maybe it's time that I gave maybe a real-world example of how the German zoning system and the American zoning system actually plays out in real life. If a developer proposes a new single-family development occupying several vacant city blocks located in a predominantly residential part of town, there would certainly be no legal reason to prohibit it in either country. In both the US and Germany, the residential group would normally be zoned under some residential label, most likely single-family residential or R1 in the US, and general residential in Germany. However, if a property owner proposes a small new store amid those residences, under US zoning, this could occur only if the future store's lot were rezoned as commercial. Such rezoning, however, in most cases is extremely unlikely. By contrast, in Germany, the store's construction would not require rezoning or other legal reclassification. Rather, the store would already be on the list of permitted uses, and planners would be unlikely to ban it if it would serve only the local residences. In other words, the underlying presumption in the United States is that a store doesn't fit among houses unless you can prove it otherwise. Whereas in Germany, the underlying presumption is that the store belongs there unless you can prove it otherwise. And the same goes for multifamily housing and mixed-use buildings. So the image that you saw in the thumbnail for this video, which shows an image of a German neighborhood that's livable, walkable, and has a mixture of both residences and shops, well, it would be mostly illegal to build that in most new suburban areas in the United States. However, I do want to play devil's advocate here for just a little bit, because for all of the grief that I've been giving Euclidean zoning up to this point, I can also understand why it is incredibly difficult for American towns to change or shift away from this style of zoning once they've already adopted it. When you design a part of the city for residential, single-family homes, you're making decisions about much more than just land use. You size the infrastructure, such as roads, utilities, and waste management facilities around the anticipated population. And city budgets across the US struggle just to meet existing needs. Very rarely will you see a city take the extra mile to future-proof a city for infill growth. So one of the biggest talking points that you'll hear at a town hall meeting from your neighborhood Karen, who's opposing the construction of a new apartment building next to her golf course McMansion, has to do with the increase in traffic that this new development would cause. And although I, like many, would probably argue that this form of NIMBY-ism, or not in my backyard opposition, well, there's a whole lot more going on there than simple opposition to traffic. She's also not necessarily wrong. In fact, during my PhD dissertation, one of the most commonly talked about barriers to low-income housing development was the cost and time of all the traffic studies requested from municipalities interested in understanding how their existing infrastructure was going to cope with the increased population in an area that was not originally built for it. But again, that's not the only argument that actually supports Euclidean zoning and is kind of a proponent of single-use exclusionary zoning policies. Because the truth of the matter is, depending on who you talk to in the United States, well, from their perspective, there's an all-out war going on against suburbia. And yeah, for this next bit, I'm going to wade carefully into a little bit of political discourse.
They're absolutely determined to eliminate single-family zoning, destroy the value of houses and communities already built. And what will be the end result is you will totally destroy the beautiful suburbs. Suburbia will be no longer as we know it.
Now, as someone who works in the housing sector, of course I'm biased. Of course I feel that housing is an incredibly important part of the health and safety and well-being of any country around the world. But housing, in particular suburbia, usually doesn't enter into the national political discourse unless you're talking about mortgage rates or the real estate market. So to be honest, I was actually moderately surprised when the very idea of suburbia itself was one of the major political talking points during the last national election. And listen, while I might not necessarily agree with it from an ideological perspective, I also can see that as a political tactic, by placing the very idea of the American dream at the center of a culture war, well, it was actually kind of smart. While we can all agree that suburban America is bad for the climate, exclusionary zoning makes it impossible to walk for just your basic amenities, and it's really forcing infrastructure development into kind of a Ponzi scheme and forcing cities into debt. Guys, I'll cover all of this in upcoming episodes, I promise. Really though, suburbia, it is a nice place to be. I mean, I grew up in the suburbs. Big backyard, quiet, peaceful environment. And if you caught last week's video about how for many Americans, their home is their social safety net and their greatest source of wealth. So when you throw that safety and that wealth into question, you can imagine people are going to get very, very passionate about any form of change. But I also think that the approach that was projected by Trump, which is to say that cities that have socioeconomic and architecturally diverse landscapes are dangerous, is also grossly misunderstanding what it takes to be a robust, healthy, and livable city. Because the thing is, he's right, the suburbs are changing, but not for the reasons he's saying. The rich and the poor in American cities are living more and more separate lives because income stratification is getting worse across the country. The trend is most worrying for low-income neighborhoods since concentrated poverty has a number of long-term effects. In urban areas, the number of families who live in poor neighborhoods has jumped from 5.5% in 1970 to 13.1% in 2012. But the same thing is happening at the other end of the income spectrum as well. Those in affluent neighborhoods have doubled during the same time frame, from 4.4% to 8.5%. That means that more than 1 in 5 city dwellers live in a very income segregated community. So when we talk about single-family exclusionary zoning policies, we aren't just talking about zoning by land use type, but ultimately in the United States today, that type of zoning policy is ultimately separating us by income. Because the very design of suburbia itself means that new neighborhoods almost always have new homes around the same price point, meaning an entire neighborhood is going to be made up of the same socioeconomic group. And this personally makes me a little bit sad because one of the things that I love so much about our cities and villages here in Germany is their diversity. I mean, do we have wealthy and poor neighborhoods? Sure. But access to amenities, schools, infrastructure, and overall social cohesion is much stronger and much more equitable. And the effects of zoning and city planning, which prioritizes walkability and livability, have staggering outcomes for the community as a whole. And let me give you an example. In our small neighborhood, which just finished construction, we have single-family homes, townhomes, duplexes, and apartments. And the price difference between the cheapest property and the most expensive property is over 600,000 euros. And they're right across the street from one another. From our home, we can walk to the train station, grocery stores, bakeries, restaurants, parks, and even a zoo. And Jack will one day walk or ride his bicycle to school. It's all part of the reason why we chose to live right here, because we wanted to be part of a community that was healthy, livable, and thriving for all different types of people in our community. Coming up on the next episode of the Black Forest Family. All right, guys, as many of you know, in May of this year, I wrapped up my PhD dissertation where I studied low-income housing tax policy. And now the time has finally come for me to share with you just why I find low-income housing fascinating. In next week's episode, I'll tell you the story of how the day modernism died, how Ronald Reagan gutted an entire cabinet of the federal government so he could buy more bombs, and how a local bank blackmailed a former American governor with pictures of his mistress. Oh, and all of these things have one thing in common: public housing. Yeah, it's gonna get juicy. So stay tuned for next week. And if you haven't already done so, be sure to hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell to get the alert when the next episode goes live. And as always, if you enjoyed today's video, I'd love it if you hit that thumbs up button and even considered sharing it with your friends. It goes a long way in helping the YouTube algorithm show our content to new audiences and ultimately supports the long-term growth of our channel. And with that, I'll see you guys next Sunday. Tschüss!